Hey guys, it's Casey and welcome back to my channel and welcome to a trip down memory lane for me, not so much for you, because today I'm going to be unpacking the brands that are still around in the year 4000, so almost 2000 years from 2026. Some of them may surprise you, some of them may not. Some of them have the same function in the future that they do in the 2026 year. Certain brands have had to evolve with the times in order to survive, and so the way that they exist in the world in 2000 years time is very, very different than how you understand them to be today. And so let's jump in and have a look at how things are going in the future. First and foremost, we have the bare bone basics of society, and that is of course the Royal Mint and the post office. Now, if you don't know what the Royal Mint is, that's probably because you're not British, but the Royal Mint is the institution that is in charge of circulating money throughout society. It is in charge of printing money. It is in charge of setting the price of gold within an economy. If you're American, you probably know it better as the federal bank. Post office is pretty self-explanatory. In fact, I'm pretty sure in 2026 it is called the post office in almost every single country, so you probably have a good idea of what the post office is, but just in case, it is the institution in charge of mail. It posts everything from one address to the next address. Every time you get an Amazon shipment, well, not every time, there are private institutions in 2026, but for the most part, everything is going through the post office. That is what the post office does in 2026, and that is what the post office does in the year 4000. Now, is the Royal Mint and the Post Office the exact same institution in the year 4000 as it is in 2026? From top to bottom? Probably not. There's probably been some restructure, there's probably been some change. It's almost certainly not the same institution that you would encounter today, but it functions in the exact same capacity, and so I feel very comfortable in saying that the Royal Mint and the Post Office proceed to exist in 2000 years' time. So there you go. The bare bone basics of society. Gotta tie my hair up for this. This is how you know it's serious work. The Vatican Holy See, which is of course the head of the Catholic Church. Now, as I've said before, and I've made videos on this before, and I'm sure that I'll make videos on it again into the future, but the face of religion in the year 4000 looks very, very different than it does today. There is a new global religion. A lot of the religions that are around today have fallen off to the wayside. They are not known as well. They are definitely not worshipped in any meaningful capacity. Think of it as how you perceive Jainism in 2026. Not that it is necessarily forgotten by history, because it isn't, but outside of academic circles, it's not known to the average person, because the average person is part of the 98% that worship this new global religion. The two major exceptions to this is Judaism, which is not surprising in any way, shape or form, given their historical tenacity. However, the way that the Jews live their lives in the year 4000 looks very, very different to how it looks in the modern West. It is almost Amish in nature, in that they cling to old ways that no longer serve the rest of society in the year 4000. And they do that by living in isolation in a walled city that they rarely leave and that they rarely allow anybody else into. And so very little is known about how they actually live their lives, but they seem to be thriving nonetheless. The second major world religion that persisted into the year 4000 was Catholicism, so the Catholic Church. However, the reason why the Catholics stuck around is very, very different to why the Jews persisted as well as they did, and it had nothing to do with their own tenacity and everything to do with the fact that when shit hit the fan in the modern West and everything started falling apart, they were the ones who first capitalized on that. And so, as is always the case, the earliest adopter is the one who ended up with the most influence. And you can see that influence quite heavily in the New World religion, which in the most simplest of terms is the worship of the moon, sun, and stars overseen by an ultimate creator. Even though the two religions are extremely different from one another, you can see a lot of Catholic influences in the way that the aesthetic is and the way that the rituals are run. So there is a little bit of aesthetic influence, which I'm not mad at, because if we're to be completely transparent, Catholicism is definitely the most attractive of world religions in 2026 in terms of aesthetics. I don't think anybody can argue that, so I'm not mad about that. And there is a fair bit of appropriation in terms of taking holiday names and a bit of their meaning and applying them to something new and revolutionary that has nothing to do with the original source of said holiday. But that's where the similarities between the two religions more or less end. For example, All Souls Day and All Saints Day are very big cultural celebrations. They're big holidays. However, the reasons why we celebrate All Souls Day and All Saints Day is very, very different to why Catholics would celebrate them. They do not sandwich Halloween. They take place in May because they sandwich Lemuria. And so, even though on the surface they sound like the same holiday, they have the same meaning that they do in the Catholic Church. The way that they are celebrated and the mythos behind why they are celebrated the way that they are is very, very different. And so that's kind of where the similarities stop, is a lot of things aesthetically look the same, but it is a completely different religion. Saying that, as I said originally, Catholicism does persist in the year 4000 in and of itself. However, it is no longer a major world religion. It occupies the same seat that is currently occupied in 2026 by Zoroastrianism, which is to say it is a former major religion that is in its last dying days. So I think in the year 4000 worldwide, there's probably about 200,000 Catholics left, and they're not like the Jews in which they're closed off from the rest of society. They are participants in society, but they do tend to keep to themselves a lot more, which I don't think is necessarily a terrible thing. That is a known phenomenon that happens in dying religions, that they tend to congregate quite closely together. In my friends, not the town itself, but in the valley that surrounded the town, there was a very strong Catholic population. The children attended the local school. They were fine. There was no complaints with any of them. It was what it was. It is what it is. I can't say anything more on it. Disney continues to hang on by its Mickey Mouse rat claws. It is not the same corporation that you know it as in 2026, but it is still hanging in there. So, in the year 4000, your governments have full control over any and all media that is consumed, that includes Disney movies. And cartoons, in particular, are only ever shown one morning a week. That is Sunday morning, from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. That is it. That is the only time in which you see cartoons. And Disney sometimes makes cartoons in that variety. It releases the occasional movie into the cinema, which is again highly regulated by your governments. Your government also does not like things that are directed towards children in a corporate sense. Your government does not like things that are directed towards children that they can become obsessed and preoccupied by. For example, I've said before on my channel, there was a time, a very brief time and space, in which we were allowed to watch Yu-Gi-Oh! In the morning on Sundays as one of the cartoons. That lasted a very brief moment in time because they did not like that children started drawing Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards and trying to trade them. They thought that was a distraction, and so they banned Yu-Gi-Oh! In saying that, Disney still has a couple of theme parks around the world. They still have a couple of resorts that you can take your family to. They are nothing like the ones that are at Disney World today or in Hawaii or Tokyo. Nothing remotely similar to that. But you can still buy your Mickey ears. You can still have breakfast with Mickey. However, it's a much, much smaller of a corporation in the year 4000. And a lot less powerful than it is today. Nintendo exists in much the same vein as Disney does in the year 4000, and that is still reaching out to its target audience. In fact, I would argue that Nintendo is probably more powerful than Disney in the year 4000, because Nintendo services gaming arcades, which are still a thing, probably a bigger thing, in fact, much definitely a bigger thing than they are in the year 2026. And they're popular. You can get home gaming devices if you come from a wealthy family. That is something that you can invest in. But again, it's not something that you would spend a lot of time doing outside of very brief moments in time because it just wouldn't be socially acceptable. But I don't think Nintendo exists in much of a different vein than it does today, to be honest. But there you go, Nintendo exists. Google and Microsoft. still exist in the year 4000, but they exist in a very different format for a very different purpose. So if you've never watched my videos before, in the year 4000, digital technology is not banned. However, it is highly socially taboo. If you're going to use technology at all, it is much preferable for you to be using analog technology over digital technology, and Google and Microsoft exist in the digital sphere. Both Google and Microsoft are owned by the same corporation, which is called Sinclair Enterprises, and the way that they run things looks very, very different. Home computers do exist, and computers in general exist in office environments. You need a license to have a computer, though. You need to apply and state your reason for having one, and even then they do not look like a modern day computer looks. It's much more brick-like. I don't even know if there's really an equivalent to it at the moment. You can go on the internet functions very differently. It is a black screen, kind of like those typing games when the entire game takes place in text. It kind of looks like that. There's not really any pictures or anything that you can look at. It's quite boring, in fact, but it still exists if you have a purpose for using it. Lego still exists in much the same format. There's really nothing that I can say about it. The only thing that's really different is that there is not a lot of licensing to Lego, so you're not going to get like a Harry Potter Lego, even though Harry Potter is still a very popular series. In the year 4000, they show it once every single year, and it's one of the most popular weekends to go to the cinemas with your friends in order to watch Harry Potter during Harry Potter season. But there is no Harry Potter Lego, there's no character Lego, it's all very basic. You're going to build a house, you're going to build this, you're going to build that, just basic things like that. So that's really the only difference in terms of Lego. Everything else is largely the same. Oh, and it's made in a different form of plastic. The plastic in general, across the board, not just in Lego, but any plastic, which is not a commonly used material anymore, but it is a specific type of plastic that dissolves when it sits in salt water for a period of time. Beauty and hygiene products, like I've said before, hygiene in general, personal hygiene and hygiene of the house and environment is held to a higher standard than it is in 2026, which I don't think is hard. Looking at myself, I am not the most pristine at the moment, but if I was in 2026, I would not be able to leave my house like this. I would have no problem leaving my house like this today. In fact, I probably will once I finish filming here and go get a drink. However, brands, Nivea. I've spoken about Nivea, how Nivea face cream is extremely popular as a moisturizer and a makeup remover. Makeup in general, Revlon, Maybelline, things like that. Any big, broad spectrum makeup brand that you can find in a drugstore at the moment. Not all of them by any means, but the big ones, they still exist. Much like Lego, what they use, what chemicals go into things, what packaging is used for it looks very, very different than it does in 2026. But you can buy nail polish, you can buy lipstick, you can buy this, you can buy that. And so there you go. Coca-Cola. It's not something you would drink every day. It is something that you would get when you go to a restaurant or in an event. And it would not come in a plastic bottle or a can. It would only ever come in a glass bottle. Much like this, but with a very different lid, in that the lid would be attached to the bottle and you had to pull it up and it'd give this awful popping sound that I hated, and so I hated opening them. I just felt like it was going to pop in my face, which was an unrealistic fear, but it's a fear that I still carry to this day if I was to open one. But there you go. If you want a nice crispy Coke, you can have a nice crispy bottle of Coke if you go to a restaurant. Catherine Constantine and Patrick Philippe, which is a very nice way of saying that you can still buy expensive watches. For the ladies, brands like Hermes still exist. However, in saying that, they have reverted back to their original roots of primarily being a tack brand for horses. And to be honest, it's not even the most popular tack brand for horses or the most luxurious, but if you want a bag from Hermes, you can probably still buy one. I don't know if you can buy a Birkin, but you can buy a bag. Belgian, which, if you don't know what that is, it is the world's, in 2026, and both in the year 4000, which is a rarity, But in both 2026 and the year 4000, it is the world's leading manufacturer of musical instruments, specifically drum cymbals, which are the things that you hit your drumsticks on when you play drums. Which, yes, drums still do exist in the year 4000. They didn't just poof off the face of the planet because someone decided that they were too modern. No, they are still a very popular instrument. My husband knew how to play the drums, and he was teaching my daughter how to play the drums at the time that things went down for us, so I quite like hearing the drums being played. But in general, music, believe it or not, in the year 4000 is significantly more popular than it is in the year 2026. Both the listening of and the making of music. A lot of people can play musical instruments. It is a very, very, very popular pastime. And if you're not playing music, you might be dancing to music. Dancing is also a highly popular pastime, whether it be ballet or a more modern, in our sense, not your sense, form of dance. And so music is, it's the lifeblood of society, basically. And it really truly is, if you consider the fact that radios are probably the most common household good, because you don't have access to a lot of internet. You don't have your phone. You can't look at that for news. You have to listen to the radio. So radios are on 24/7 in a lot of people's houses, even when they're asleep. And last, well, not last in terms of everything that's ever existed. A lot of other brands still exist, but the last one I'm going to cover in this video is the Olympics. The Olympics still exist, and they are still dorky. So they still exist in largely the same format that they do at the moment. If you've seen the Olympics in 2026, you have seen them in the year 4000. But there you go, that is my video for today. I probably could have done a better job at it, but I don't care. I just wanted to get it out into the world, and now you have watched it and it is out into the world. So this is Casey signing off for the night. As always, stay weird out there, stay safe, and have a productive evening. Good night.